Tonight I'm showing you 7 clamping tips that will definitely simplify your life. In my current shop, I've been working for 7 years without a bench vise. Now this isn't to say that I'm opposed to bench vises, I just hadn't found a good spot for one yet, and then 7 years passed. So the first tip is how to hold or clamp your work in place without having a vise. If you're planing down the face of a board, clamp a block of wood in front and a block of wood behind it to lock it in place. Then you should have no issue planing the board. The same thing can be done with the edge of the board, although it helps to have a 90-degree brace to hold it in place too. For angles or odd shapes, just figure out the direction that you'll be cutting and put a board at 90 degrees to that cutting direction to resist the force of your chisel or your plane. Your piece may not even need to be actually clamped down to work on. Also, make sure that if you're building a workbench that will be used for clamping, that it has an overhanging edge that you can actually clamp to. Another easy viseless trick that actually has been around for hundreds of years is called the bench hook. This is for holding something long and skinny while you cut it with a saw. It can be used to cut a board, a dowel, or anything else that you need to cut with a handsaw. The next tip is to get creative with your trigger clamps. These are my go-to clamps for any quick clamping solution that I need. Usually these have a soft material here on the feet which make it so that it doesn't mark up the surface. These clamps can be clamped to each other to make a longer clamp. Some of these clamps even have the interlocking feature designed into the head of the clamp so that you can interlock 2 clamps together. They can be great as a brace for other clamps or wedges if you want to clamp something to an edge. The heads on these clamps can usually be disconnected and switched around if you need reverse clamping pressure or even a jack to carefully separate something. There's some fancy trigger clips for sale now that have a spring mechanism that makes it so when you push the button on the bottom here, it closes automatically. But there's a trick that I learned from Izzy Swan where you can actually just take a rubber band, put it around your clamps, and then it does the same thing. The next tip is to plan out your clamping pads. Most clamps will leave some sort of a mark on the wood that you're clamping to. Of course, this depends on the clamping pressure and the hardness of the wood you're using. It's usually more apparent in softwoods than in hardwoods, but if you put a lot of pressure in your clamps, you're still going to get an imprint. I like to use something for my clamping pad that is softer than the material that I'm clamping together. That way the imprint goes into the pad and not into the wood. This can be softwood blocks, cardboard, paper, tape, or even leather if you want to get fancy. Tape or temporarily glue them to your clamps or boards ahead of time so they won't fall off as you're tightening your complicated glue up. I've had to learn this the hard way more than once in order to get it burned into my brain that I need to set up my clamping pads before I get the glue out. This next quick tip is one you can use when clamping up any sort of box or square. Put your clamps on lightly at first and then measure the diagonal going both directions. If they're the same number, then you know your box is square. If one diagonal is longer than the other, you need to push in on the corners of the longer diagonal to make it square. This also works on big stuff too, like this trestle table base. Next up is something called clamping cowls. These are basically 2 long boards with a straight edge along at least one side. You can actually even make this slightly concave to make sure to get good pressure. These can be used when you're clamping up a wide flat panel to make sure the glue up doesn't buckle in the middle. They can also be used when you're clamping up thin strips to allow for you to use less clamps to glue up the same area. When you clamp a board, the clamping force is distributed outward at a 45-degree angle on either side of your clamping point. You have to make sure that your 45-degree angle line overlaps with the one from the neighboring clamp before it gets to your glue line. If it doesn't, then you'll end up needing more clamps to fill those gaps. This works on a stack of thin strips. This also works when you're gluing edge banding on a piece of plywood. Another trick you can do on edge banding is to use masking tape or painter's tape to hold the strip in place. Just rip off a bunch of pieces and hold the tape down on the edge before wrapping it around on either side. Now this one will help you get the edges of your glue up aligned before you start tightening your big clamp. Use some smaller clamps or vice grips to hold your ends together before clamping. This basically gives you a third hand that will be able to keep the ends aligned while you tighten the main clamps. If you have a clamp or vice grip with a deeper throat, you can actually use it along the length of the board to align the edges before you tighten each clamp. Now for a router table clamp tip. If you have a small piece that you need to route, but you don't want to risk getting your fingers too close to the bit, Use your clamp as a finger extension to hold the piece close to the bit without being concerned about getting hurt. I like doing this with wooden clamps because I'm less concerned about the bit getting damaged if it runs into the corner of the clamp. Clamps are an essential part of any woodworking shop, and you can never have too many. If you don't have that many right now, just get a few for each project you build, and eventually you'll end up like this guy, or this guy. Now I know many of you have clamping tips, tricks, and hacks that I may not have shared in the video today. So if so, leave that in the comments below. Otherwise, pick up your very own clamp shirt right here. There's links below. Now, go build something, and we'll see you next time.